Hey, class, welcome back. And we are going to get into Chapter 8, Part 2, still talking about securing the Republic. So far we have talked about the George Washington presidency, which was 2 terms, and then we talked about the John Adams presidency, which only lasted 1 term, which, considering the unpopularity of his policies, is really not very surprising. So let's get started. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the election of 1800. So we are getting into the 19th century. And then we're going to talk about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and some important key things that happened during Jefferson's time as president. So we're going to begin by talking about the election of 1800, what Jefferson referred to as a political revolution. So the way that voting worked back in 1800 was that the Electoral College electors would cast two votes, and they could vote for whoever they wanted, but they had to put 2 names up. And the way that it worked, and I mentioned this, I think, in the last lecture, is that whoever got the most votes would become the president, and whoever got the second most votes would become the vice president. Well, in the election of 1800, there were 2 candidates that got an equal amount of the vote, and that was Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. They were both Democratic Republicans. So again, we're talking about people who supported politicians who supported small government, decentralized government. Democratic Republicans were typically more pro-French than their Federalist counterparts. Federalists, on the other hand, very centralist, believed in the power of a strong central government, and they tended to be more in support of England when it came to the wars between France and England. So you can see here who the candidates were. For the Democratic Republicans, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, as I've already mentioned. And for the Federalists, John Adams tried to go for a second term, C.C. Pinckney, and John Jay. Because the election results were disputed, there was a runoff, and the House of Representatives had to determine who would become the next president. And so there was a lot of backroom kind of campaigning going on to get people to change their votes. And eventually, Thomas Jefferson will get more votes after they had voted 36 times. They had to do 36 votes before somebody finally changed their mind and voted instead in favor of Thomas Jefferson. The election of 1800 is notable because of a political shift of power, right? Because the first 2 presidents, George Washington and John Adams, were more of the Federalist mindset. And now we have the Democratic Republicans, and most notably Thomas Jefferson, who is going to come in and really change a lot of things within the federal government. So here we have an image of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So one of the people who really advocated for Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr was Alexander Hamilton. Even though Alexander Hamilton was very much a Federalist, he thought that Thomas Jefferson would be a better choice over Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was somebody who was Alexander Hamilton's political rival in New York. And ultimately, this is going to culminate in a very hostile relationship between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, which will end in a duel, which will actually kill Alexander Hamilton. And so this feud really, it kind of begins with this presidential runoff. So here we have an electoral map. An electoral map shows us how many votes each person got in the various states. And you can see here the electoral vote count for Thomas Jefferson was equal to that of Aaron Burr with a tie of 73. Again, that was broken after 36 more times of voting. John Adams got 65 electoral votes, C.C. Pinckney 64, and John Jay just got 1. You can also see the map is color coded where people are voting. You can see the majority of the Federalists are up here in the north, in the northeast, and with the exception of a little few votes down here in Virginia. So, as I mentioned, this election, a political power shift, and it does also prove that there can be a peaceful transition of power. And this was really important, right? Because um, in a democracy, in a democratic republic, you have to agree whether or not you necessarily agree with the election results. You have to agree to this peaceful transition of power. And that is something that we really kind of take for granted here in the United States. In a lot of other places in the world, that those types of power shifts do not happen peacefully. And of course, the people end up suffering because of it. So this proves that the United States can endure that peaceful transition of power from one political party to another. So another very interesting thing about the year 1800 is an event that comes to be known as Gabriel's Rebellion. And Gabriel was a slave. He was a 24-year-old blacksmith, and he was a literate slave. He had actually been taught to read. Even though technically you were not supposed to teach slaves to read, sometimes they would get taught to read from various sources. And the story goes that Gabriel stole a pig. And, you know, this was not uncommon. Oftentimes, slaves were not well fed, and so sometimes they would steal animals to try to supplement their diet. And when he was caught stealing the pig. He actually bit the white person who was trying to restrain him, right? And because of that, and also the fact that he was stealing a pig, he was incarcerated. He was publicly humiliated. He was branded, like with a hot iron. And so he becomes really embittered from this experience, understandably. And he begins to create kind of like a little armory in his blacksmithing shop. So he begins to create swords, and he begins to blacksmith bullets and all of these things that he begins to build up an armory to organize a rebellion. And he's doing this secretly, right? But he is being inspired by the Haitian Revolution, because the Haitian Revolution, of course, is well underway in Haiti. And it is really a turning point in 1800 where you're starting to see that there could be actually liberation for the enslaved population of Haiti. So Gabriel is organizing this big rebellion, and this is happening in Virginia. And on August 30th of 1800, they gather to carry out this rebellion. And the flag, they create this flag, and the motto on the flag says "Death or Liberty." And but then on the horizon, a big thunderstorm begins to show up in the sky. And thunderstorms sometimes can form like that really suddenly, kind of out of nowhere. And the plot is to carry out this rebellion is actually postponed. It's said that some of the slaves that had gathered to carry out this rebellion got scared by this, what they thought was a bad omen, and they went to the authorities. And so they basically told on Gabriel and his fellow co-conspirators. And so he is forced to basically flee. And he eventually is found and arrested and hung. And when the whole thing was said and done, 27 black men will hang for having conspired to carry out this rebellion. And it was a very violent backlash against the enslaved people of Virginia, even though the rebellion was never carried out. I mean, the plot was that they were going to go to Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of Virginia. They were going to take the governor of the of Virginia, who at the time was James Monroe. They were going to take him hostage, and then they were going to demand boats so that they could sail to Haiti to join the revolution in Haiti. But again, it was never carried out. But there was this massive, violent backlash against the enslaved people of Virginia and all around the South, really, because of this rebellion. Um, Gabriel's Rebellion is important because even though it was never carried out, like I said, it leads to this big backlash against enslaved people. New anti-literacy laws are passed, stricter anti-literacy laws are passed, and then laws against the hiring out of slaves are passed as well. So one of the things that would have made Gabriel's Rebellion successful was the fact that he was a blacksmith and he had access to all of the tools of the blacksmith shop. So they were well armed because he was able to make the weapons necessary to carry out this rebellion. And so to prevent that from happening in the future, there were stricter laws put on hiring out of slaves to apprentice with, for example, blacksmith shops. So this was, and the other important thing about Gabriel's Rebellion, besides these laws that are passed, these strict laws that are passed in response to it, is also that the fact that it shows how thousands of enslaved people in North America were becoming inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And it's interesting to think about the fact that they knew about that this was happening, even though it was so far away, even though many of them were illiterate. It was simply the news of the Atlantic world and the American world as it traveled through on boats and sailors and and people, of course, writing about it in newspapers. So it's interesting to think about that as well. So Gabriel's Rebellion, even though it doesn't get carried out, it does kind of set the tone moving into the 19th century of stricter, more oppressive measures for enslaved people. Okay, we're now going to turn to talk about Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was somebody who is larger than life, really, in American history when we talk about the founders of America. He is credited, of course, for being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, he wrote the statute for Virginia's religious freedom. He was the founder of the University of Virginia. He was the French ambassador for America. He also sold his books to found the start of the Library of Congress. And he was somebody who kind of interestingly died. He was born in 1743. He dies on July 4th of 1826, which is actually the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. An interesting little factoid is also that John Adams died on that same day, July 4th of 1826. What you're looking at in this photograph right here is Monticello, and this was a plantation house that he built along with a bunch of his slaves when he was 26 years old. He married a woman by the name of Martha Wales Skelton, and they were married 10 years. They had 6 children together, but only 2 lived to adulthood. And Martha actually dies giving birth to the last child. Um, he owned in his lifetime over 400 enslaved people, many of whom he inherited from his father or his father in law. 80 of these enslaved people lived in Monticello, and Monticello was also Thomas Jefferson's private residence. Unlike George Washington, Thomas Jefferson will free only 7 of his enslaved people. Um, 2 people he will enslave people he will free in his lifetime, and 5 of them he will free in his will. All of the enslaved people that he frees are members of the Hemings family. And it is said that he most certainly fathered at least 2 children by his slave, Sally Hemings. And if you're interested in more of that story, look into the instructor video links for the on the optional resources in Canvas, where there is a video talking about this relationship that he had with Sally Hemings, which happened after he was widowed. But he ends up having children with her, and it has now been verified through DNA evidence that he did indeed have children with Sally Hemings. So it's interesting because when we think about Thomas Jefferson, we have to think about a man who is probably very much personally conflicted by these ideals, these 2 sides, which he really carried with him throughout his life. He was a slave owner, but on one hand, but on the other hand, he was the author of the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, right? He certainly fathered these kids from his one of his slaves. So he's an interesting dichotomy when you think about it. He believed in this idea of simple republicanism, which was essentially that the government, the federal government, should be small, and that state government should have the majority of the power. He believed in an agrarian nation, so he believed that land equaled wealth and that land should be available to all Americans. So he was very much a believer in spreading the United States westward, which actually does happen during his presidency. Um, he had a reputation as being a very curious intellectual. He was somebody who was fascinated by the ideas of the Enlightenment and certainly by ideas of science. He was not non-religious, but he was one of the deist founding fathers, which means that he believed in a higher power, but he didn't necessarily believe that a higher power or a God intervened in people's daily lives. Um, so he will be the second president to actually live in the White House. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House. Thomas Jefferson will be the second. Interestingly, even though George Washington put a lot of time and effort to help design the presidential mansion, what we now call the White House, he actually never lived in the White House. But Thomas Jefferson will live in the White House, and he comes to be known as somebody who has a very informal style of governing. So, yes, let's talk about Jefferson's presidency. So, here is an image of what the White House looked like during Jefferson's presidency. This is also the very same White House that will end up getting burned by the British in the War of 1812. And of course, we will talk about that when we talk about the War of 1812. So, women, although women were very much a part of Jefferson's private life because his 2 surviving kids were daughters and they were very close to him. And by all accounts, Sally Hemings was also very close to him and influential in his life. In his presidential life, women didn't play a very large role. In other words, in all public appearances, he appeared to be a bachelor. As I mentioned, he had a very informal presidency. He was known to answer the door of the White House, in his robe and slippers. He would often be sort of very shoddily dressed, and he would go out and ride his horse around, Washington City, what we now call Washington, D.C. And he would, chat with, people on the street. Keep in mind, this is also a time period where people had a lot of access to the White House. So, you could go and you could make an appointment to sit down and actually speak with the president. And certainly he would have been the type of president that would have been open to doing that without a whole lot of ceremony involved. Um, During his presidency, and he does serve 2 terms, as we can see by the dates, from 1801 to 1809. He reduces the size of the military. He abolishes federal taxes, including the hated excise tax. He repealed the Alien and Sedition Acts that had been passed by John Adams, which many people thought were unconstitutional. And he believed that the federal government's role should be limited to just very basic things, such as maintaining a postal system, the federal court system, the coastal lighthouses, and to collect custom duties and to take the census. So, really, sort of bare bones federal government is what Jefferson believed in. And whenever he could, whenever he had the power to do so and the backing of the Congress, of course, he did whatever he could to really pare down the federal government as much as possible. So during Jefferson's presidency, um, there will be a very famous court case that will happen called Marbury versus Madison. And this is in 1803. This is a landmark Supreme Court case. So basically, Jefferson was faced with 217 last minute appointments of Federalists. So the outgoing president, John Adams, basically appointed 217 federal judges, like at the last minute, what's called midnight judges, before he left the presidency, essentially packing the federal judiciary with Federalist judges. And basically Jefferson refuses to honor these midnight judgeships. And he says, it wasn't basically, fair for him to, pack the courts with these judges before, as he was the outgoing president. And a man by the name of William Marbury, who would have received one of these commissions, one of these judgeships, sued the Secretary of State, who at the time was James Madison, for failure to make good on the appointment. And this lawsuit, a federal lawsuit, goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case Marbury versus Madison that although Marbury's commission was valid and the new president should have delivered it, the court could not compel him to do so. So, in other words, the court could not make the president honor these judgeships. The court found that the grounds of Marbury's suit, resting in the Judiciary Act of 1789, conflicted with Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. And so it was in conflict. This act of Congress that had been passed in 1789, which was the Judiciary Act, was actually in conflict with a section of the U.S. Constitution. Now, why does this matter, right? Why are we talking about it in history class? Well, the reason why is because this becomes a landmark case, because this forms the legal basis, the legal precedent for the Supreme Court's exercise of judicial review. So, what does that mean? That means that this particular court case sets the precedent that the Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution, which, of course, is part of their job, but also to invalidate laws passed by Congress if they are unconstitutional. So this gives the Supreme Court an incredible amount of power. Basically, what this says is that the Supreme Court, through the power of judicial review, can essentially invalidate laws passed by Congress if they are found to be unconstitutional. So that's a very powerful mandate moving forward. And so the Supreme Court really has a lot of power, as it does to this very day, based on this landmark case, Marbury v. Madison. Okay, so another major thing that happens during the Jefferson presidency is the Louisiana Purchase. So let me just give you a little bit of background on the Louisiana Purchase. So up through the 7 Years' War, France claimed, but only lightly settled, a large expanse of land west of the Mississippi River, only to lose it to Spain in the Treaty of Paris of 1763 after the 7 Years' War. The biggest concern of the Spanish governor of New Orleans was the small population of Lower Louisiana, too small to ward off an anticipated westward movement of the Americans. Spanish officials encouraged European immigration further up the river at St. Louis. The Spanish welcomed Native American refugees from the Northwest Territory. So they were, creating these antagonisms between, the Spanish would create these, areas of refuge, not just for the Native Americans, but they also did it for enslaved people, as we saw with the Stono Rebellion. But in 1802, during the Jefferson presidency, rumors reached Jefferson that Spain had struck a secret bargain with France to hand over a large part of Spain's trans-Mississippi territory to Napoleon in exchange for some land in Italy. Jefferson, who did not want to see France grow as a colonial power in North America, sent a man by the name of Robert R. Livingston, America's minister to France, to try and buy New Orleans. Okay, so Livingston is sent to try and negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. Now, New Orleans, as I'm going to show you right here on the laser pointer, in a very strategic location on the Gulf of Mexico. It's also at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which stretches all the way up into the northern territories. And so this was a very strategic location. So Jefferson, sending Livingston, and he's thinking to himself, well, hopefully he can negotiate something and at least get New Orleans. Well, it turns out that the French, who at this time were in very dire need of money because they were deep into the Napoleonic Wars and they were trying to subdue the Haitian Revolution, instead offered the entire Louisiana territory to the Americans for a price of $15 million, which would be equivalent to 3 cents an acre today. So look at this territory. All of this area here in this brown color is what was purchased for $15 million by the Jefferson administration. You'll notice that there are 2 major Native American tribes living in this region, the Osage and the Comanche. And so we're going to talk a little bit about them later on, but Jefferson certainly recognized that that there would have to be negotiations done with these tribes in order to move into these territories. The other thing that this map shows is these various expeditions, one of which we are going to talk about next, which is the Lewis and Clark expedition that you will see mapped here, leaving from St. Louis, wintering at Fort Mandan, and then going out to the Oregon country, which was then claimed by all sorts of people, but mostly England. And then out to the Columbia River, where eventually they will reach the Pacific Ocean, and then they will return back. You'll also notice here on the map there is another explorer, a man by the name of Zebulon Pike, who actually goes down into this southern region. He's actually briefly captured by the Spanish and then later on released. So Jefferson recognized immediately that this territory that had just been bought by and almost doubled the size of the United States would have to be explored, right? And that's where these expeditions come in. So now let's talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition. So who you see pictured here is Meriwether Lewis on the left and William Clark on the right. Meriwether Lewis, who is somebody who was very much trusted by Thomas Jefferson. In fact, Meriwether Lewis had served as Thomas Jefferson's private secretary. And he decides to put Meriwether Lewis in charge of this corps of discovery, which is going to go out with the mission to essentially document this area, this newly acquired territory, document the animals, the plants, the people, the types of people that they run across, create diplomatic relations with any Indian tribes that they run across, and also find a northwest passage, hopefully a water route to the Pacific. They had no idea how far the Pacific Ocean was or if there was a water route to there, which that's what they were hoping they would find. Meriwether Lewis chose William Clark to co-lead the expedition with him. William Clark was somebody that Lewis had met while fighting in the Revolutionary War. Clark was a very capable map maker, and he was somebody that Meriwether Lewis felt he could trust. So they set off on this expedition. They set off from St. Louis with one river raft, essentially. I'm going to show you an image of it coming up, and two smaller boats with a crew of 45 men. And they're going up the Missouri River, and they're going upriver. And this is before the time, just before actually, the time of steamboats. So they're having to paddle upriver. So it's a very slow going process at this first part of their expedition. On their way upriver, they stop and winter at a place that they will call Fort Mandan. And basically, they are going to there run across the Mandan people, and they run across a French trapper by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau. And Toussaint Charbonneau had a young wife by the name of Sacagawea. And Sacagawea, or sometimes she's called Sacagawea, sometimes she's called Sacagawea, but she was somebody who had been brought to the Mandan village as a young girl. And she was actually Shoshone, which was a tribe that was further west. And so she ends up coming along on this expedition with her husband Charbonneau and their infant baby boy to help guide the expedition, but also to help interpret. And she ends up being one of the most valuable members of the Corps of Discovery. She ends up saving them on several occasions. And she basically is somebody who is highly admired and respected by the core crew. And we know this through their journals and their writings about her and her really heroic deeds during the expedition. They will also be joined by a slave. This was a slave that was owned by William Clark, a man by the name of York. This expedition is remarkable for so many reasons, but first and foremost, one of the most remarkable things about it is that only one person died on this expedition, which is remarkable. And he died basically of a burst appendix. So he probably would have died regardless of whether or not he was on the expedition. So a lot of people have really credited that to the leadership of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They tended to throw decisions back to the expedition a lot. They voted a lot on what to do in certain circumstances. And ultimately, they're going to be successful in making it to the Pacific Ocean, although, of course, they never find this famed, Northwest Passage. Instead, what they find is a continental divide and lots of mountains that they had to cross. So looking here at the map again that we've already looked at, I just want to point some things out. So here the expedition takes off from St. Louis in May of 1804. They end up wintering here at Fort Mandan. This is where they pick up Charbonneau and Sacagawea and their baby. And then they travel westward. Now, basically, anything west of Fort Mandan was unknown territory. Even this was pretty unknown, but this was really unknown. And right about here, as they got to the Continental Divide, the expedition expected that they were going to be able to climb a mountain and on the other side see the Pacific Ocean. Instead, what they found was the Continental Divide and these massive mountain ranges, essentially the Rocky Mountains and the Bitterroot Mountains, that they had to cross over. The other thing that happens in this area is that remarkably, Lewis and Sacagawea and some others had broken from the rest of the group to go and try to find a Indian tribe to trade for some horses, because they realized, first off, the river had run out. The Missouri River ran out, and the headwaters were up here. It basically became a little tiny trickle. So now they were on land, and they had to abandon their boats. And so they needed horses to get over the mountains. So anyway, so they go off on this little side expedition. And then one of the most remarkable coincidences in all of history takes place, which is that they come across a war party of Shoshone, and they're coming up on them, and they're coming up in an aggressive way. And all of a sudden, their leader looks down and has a look of recognition on his face when he sees Sacagawea. It turns out that this man is not only the chief of the Shoshone tribe, but he is also Sacagawea's brother. And there's this like remarkable reunion where they're jumping up and down, and they're having they're giving each other hugs, and they're so happy to see each other. Sacagawea had been taken by the Mandans from the Shoshone when she was like 12 or 13, so she hadn't seen her brother in several years. So not only does she save the expedition at that particular point from this Indian war party, but she also then is able to negotiate to get a bunch of horses and supplies and things that they're going to need to continue on with their expedition to the Pacific Ocean when it becomes clear that it's going to take a while to get there. So they get the horses from the Shoshone and they cross over the Bitterroots. It's a very difficult journey, and they end up getting trapped in some snowstorms, and they're eating like the leather of their boots, and they're eating candles, and they're trying to survive. And eventually they will make it across, remarkably, again, with nobody dying, and they get to the Columbia River. And when they get to the Columbia River, they are so happy to be at the Columbia River because the river is flowing towards the ocean. And so they are able then, again, with the help of native people, to carve out some canoes, and they get into the river and they ride downstream all the way to the ocean, where they are then able to hunker down in winter. When they get to the ocean, one of the most remarkable things takes place in the history of the expedition, and that's that Lewis and Clark decide to put a vote to the group as to what to do for the winter. And it was either we hunker down here on the coast, or we go up the Columbia River, and we hunker down with the Nez Perce, who had helped them make the canoes, right? So they put the vote to the Corps of Discovery, to the expedition, and they allow everybody in the expedition to vote, not just the males. And the free people. They allowed York to vote. He's an enslaved black man. They allowed Sacagawea to vote. She's Native American, and also, of course, a woman. And so this just shows like the type of leadership that they had, and the type of empowerment that they gave to their expedition. And so one of the reasons why they are really credited with the survival of this, and the success of this expedition. So they wintered there over the winter of 1805 to 1806. And then at that point, they return and they get back to St. Louis in November of 1805. They drop off Charbonneau and Sacagawea and their baby back at Fort Mandan on their way. So when they get back to St. Louis, there's all of this celebration. Yay, they have made it. They have collected and documented all of these plant and animal specimens. In some cases, they actually had already sent some of these specimens back to Thomas Jefferson, who liked to collect these types of things. They had charted the geography of the Western region. They had been successful in creating some trade relationships with some of the Indian tribes. And most remarkably, they had survived and lived to tell the story. Um, Meriwether Lewis will, as part of his payment for having led this expedition, become the governor of the Louisiana Territory, which is essentially that entire territory there. And the Clark will be rewarded by becoming governor of the Missouri Territory and head of the Department of Indian Affairs. Um, Sadly, Sacagawea will actually die in 1812, just 7 years after the end of the expedition. And she had had a second child, and William Clark will actually adopt Sacagawea's children with his wife Julia Hancock, and raise them in St. Louis. Meriwether Lewis, on the other hand, had a much sadder fate. Meriwether Lewis was somebody who was a perfectionist, and he was charged with having to report back to the president. And he was supposed to write a very detailed report of the entire exposition. And he slumps into a major depression, and is unable to write about it, is unable to report back to the president. And finally, the president says, okay, Lewis, you got to come back. You got to come to Washington, D.C., and just come and see me. Give me what you got and, report back to me. So Meriwether Lewis leaves St. Louis, sails down the Mississippi River to a trail that will take him over to Washington, D.C. And at an inn along that trail on his way to Washington, D.C., he shot and killed himself. And very interestingly, he shot himself with two guns at the same time. So when they found him, he actually had a bullet hole in his head and another one in his abdomen. So sadly, that was the fate of Meriwether Lewis. Some people think that it's possible that he might have picked up syphilis on the trip because, there is evidence that there was some sexual relationships between the men of the Corps of Discovery and the Native American women as they were, traveling along. So he might have picked up syphilis. That syphilis might have gone to his brain. So he might have had neurosyphilis, which would have contributed to his depressions or his delusions or whatever it was that he was dealing with. But it's kind of an interesting little side note and a tragic end to what actually is really quite a remarkable story. It's one of my favorite stories in American history just because of how remarkable it is to have an adventure like this. And the idea of going off into territories in areas that had not been documented or written about before, I think is also very fascinating. Okay, so here we have an artist rendering of what the Lewis and Clark boat would have looked like at the beginning of their journey. You'll notice here, of course, the oars for paddling, but they also had these big poles that they used to push themselves along because they would oftentimes get caught on sandbanks along the river because the river isn't always very deep. Again, here's another artist rendering. You have Lewis and Clark, but then you have Sacagawea. You see she's got her baby on her back there. And then you have York, who eventually will be freed by Clark, although Clark reluctantly frees York. It's kind of like he had to beg for his freedom, even though he had, survived this journey. He had been very much an equal member of the Corps of Discovery. So the other thing that Lewis and Clark did as they were going along their expedition is they carried with them these peace medals. These were peace medals that were given to them by Thomas Jefferson, and you'll notice here is a tomahawk and a peace pipe, and the showing of shaking of hands. It says peace and friendship, and basically they were instructed to give these peace medals to the Native American chiefs that they encountered. And they were supposed to kind of inform the chiefs that they had a big chief back in Washington, D.C., that was now in charge. But it was supposed to be done like in a very sort of like, I want to say paternalistic kind way, right? And remarkably, actually, the Lewis and Clark only documented one um, close call in terms of a violent conflict between the expedition and Native Americans, and it never even came to any kind of violence. It was just that there were some Native Americans that were following them at one point as they were going up the Missouri River, and they were a war party, and so they were kind of making like threatening gestures. I think that they had at one point tried to stop the expedition and asked them for money or something to pass through their territory, which the expedition actually refused to do. But eventually, it was resolved, and so they were allowed to move ahead. But that was the only close call. So again, another really sort of interesting and remarkable thing about this expedition is that they didn't have any violent encounters. And part of that also, and Lewis and Clark actually credited Sacagawea with being part of the reason why that was because, of course, she was a symbol of peace. You know, you don't travel with a woman and a child if you're part of a war party, right? So she just, in and of herself, her very presence was a symbol of peace. Okay, so finally, I want to wrap up today's lecture by talking about the Osage and Comanche Indians, which I showed you on the map earlier. So we've got these big tribal confederations of Osage and Comanches, and Jefferson knew that with the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, he would have to reach out to these tribes. And indeed, he did. He sent people to go out and communicate with them that they were welcome to come to Washington, D.C. to kind of meet their new big chief, you know, their new leader, essentially. And the Osage agreed to do that. And they actually traveled to Washington. They actually, Jefferson hosted them in the White House and, you know, of course, was very fascinated by their culture and everything. And they signed some treaties. And of course, these treaties gave up a certain amount of territorial rights to their land. The Comanche, on the other hand, refused to go, refused to you know, give up any land, and will continue to. They'll manage to keep their freedom and their territory, but they will also fight back. When settlers begin to come into their territories, the Comanches were one of multiple tribes in the Western territories that will fight, understandably, to keep their land and their territory. So this image here is of Comanche warriors, and this is in 1892. So it gives you a sense of how long some of these Western tribes really held on to their land and their territory and fought being put on reservations, which I talk more about in History 18. So that's it for this lecture. And let me know if you have any questions, and take care.